only allowing softball questions as well. So. Spring training. Yeah.
I've given them initial softball questions. I haven't told them that the hard questions are coming later.
That's right. Yeah, you missed the
Increasing difficulty like
the lights. All right. Welcome everybody. Welcome. Day 2. I was impressed yesterday with everybody's participation despite massive jet lag. Almost half the room put up their hand with suffering from jet lag. So we're hoping the caffeine levels are as high as yesterday. Thanks for all the presenters yesterday. That last session, Mark Sadler, UD as he's now known. That's our first inside joke, Uncle Dick. UD, Mark Sadler, special kudos, thank you. We're just going to quickly go over the agenda today, if you want to have a look. We've got 4 sessions. It's really quite jam-packed, but it's exciting. It's going to be quick. A lot of external people, a lot of different formats, so I'm sure I'm going to mess it up, so be kind. This first one is on demographics and diet. We've got a really interesting panel here I'll introduce in a second. After break, we go to technology and innovation. Another set of panelists. Really interesting, actually. After lunch, we move into fragility and conflict. That's already been flagged, of course, as a very important issue. And lastly, we've got communications in agriculture. So we'll see how good they are at communicating at the end of the day to a room full of jet-lagged people. So we're hoping that it all goes well. Couple quick announcements. All these presentations will be available online. So we'll have them, all the resources in one place for you. And don't worry about asking people for them. By the way, that green gift that you got was actually a lunchbox, an insulated lunchbox. So just so you know, I mean, I didn't know what it was. I was throwing my trash in it, but it's really cool. It's an insulated lunchbox. Yes, thank you. We have a lost and found section right here, which includes a coat and a water bottle and a bank computer. So the sheepish person who left their bank computer can see us. I want, at coffee break, all the presenters for this next session, can you please meet me here before the coffee break? All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get going on this interesting panel here. And I'd like to introduce them. I was telling Tim Searchinger that I was prepared to really dislike him because after reading his qualifications, fortunately, he's a decent human being. He's got, listen to this, research scholar at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, plus a JD from Yale Law School, senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. I mean, that's a bit too much, isn't it? Consultant to the Climate Smart Agriculture team. This is really interesting. Author of a series of papers in science that did the first calculations of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with land use change due to biofuels. So some really interesting stuff here. Also senior fellow technical director of the Next World Resources Report. This is the moderator, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Searchinger. Sorry, that was polite applause. Can we have some real applause? I mean, you know, I have to do my best for the panel here. Julie Howard, right here. I mean, again, pretty great credentials. But listen to this. Senior advisor to the Associate Provost and Dean for International Studies and Programs at Michigan State. But a really interesting career. In addition to that, at USAID, the chief scientist, the first chief scientist at the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. She directed research policy and human and institutional capacity development programs for Feed the Future. I'm sure all of you know about Feed the Future, but it's one of the most innovative programs at USAID, as you probably all are very familiar, and a long history of dealing with things. I think in particular your work with with youth and skill development is particularly appropriate here. Chris Walker, I mean, again, the credentials, it's just too much. You're the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which I think, if you don't know about it, is a really interesting and important Forum. He's the director based in North America and manages the relationships with more than 40 Fortune 500 countries, the engagement with the financial ICT sectors. Before that, he's been executive officer of the Carbon Trust, but a real focus on climate and sustainability. So Chris, we're really happy to have you here as well. Emmy Simmons. Emmy Simmons, a long history for any of us in the trade, in the food security trade. We all know Emmy Simmons. USAID, really a long, interesting career, you know, as many of them did, started with a really in the field, more than 30 years there, all sorts of boards, including the World Vegetable Center, the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa, and now a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems, and also a very nice person. So what can you do? Buona Adewale, welcome. And I'm going to just let people see who you are here. Research fellow for the Harvest Plus program at IFPRI. Again, I was just having a look at this program, incredibly interesting. We're going to look forward to hearing from you, and a lot of linkages here. He's leading on impact research, on technology adaptation and acceptance, PhD in agriculture and resource economics, Cambridge, dealt with the private sector, including dealing with Fortune 500 companies. He's consulted for a whole range of organizations and doing current research work, which I think is very interesting, on this nexus between agriculture, food security, environment, and governments, including the Global Index on Development. I mean, this is like an hour long just to get through your credentials here. Tim, could we welcome you? Tim's going to start us off with some thoughts. We're going to have a panel discussion. We're going to have some questions and answers. So please give them your full attention.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. If we could bring up the slideshow, whoever is in charge of that. Oh, there we are. Okay. Well, thank you very much. As we do have a good opportunity here for discussion. I'm going to give a little presentation. Each panelist is going to talk a while. We're going to have some discussion, then open up for questions. So we have abundant time, and because I'm the moderator, they can't say anything particularly nasty about the subsequent presentation. So this is what I'm going to talk about. My work is essentially how do you feed the world without destroying the world. One of the things I've done is I've helped produce 11 reports with the World Resources Institute on various topics. I'm going to focus on that, but particularly with regard to diet. It includes, I didn't put up the link. You can find them just by Googling Creating Sustainable Food Future, WRI, if you're interested. And this is a full-length report. And this is supposed to move forward?
Give that a good squeeze, Tim, and point it over there.
It's the green button, right?
Yeah.
Somebody else control it?
There we go, yes.
Okay, great.
Otherwise, I'm sure you'll give it by memory.
So, of course, the challenge starts with the fact that agriculture occupies about half of the world's vegetated land, and of the remainder, we manipulate at least half of that for forestry activity. And that manipulation of the world's, half of that world's land is responsible for about 1/3 of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today. And you've seen these numbers before. Agriculture, including land use change, contributes on the order of 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And one thing just to help highlight here, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is that ruminant production is responsible for about half of that, both in the production emissions and the land use change emissions. And I'm going to keep coming back to that because when we think of diets, we think of sustainability, we ultimately keep coming back to the question of how much meat and milk, and above all, beef and mutton we produce. So the estimates are for very large increases in demand. We're on a course for very large increases in demand for livestock products by 2050. Boy, this is really slow, sorry. And we also are on the order for about 70% increases in demand for crops. And that's a question of how we do that. Now, one of the challenges is we also have to produce all that food without increasing the price of food particularly much. I don't have the chart shine here, but one reason we only have maybe 650, 700 million hungry people on the planet today, is actually that global food prices are significantly lower than they were back in the 1960s. And so if you increase those prices a lot, you're going to have more hungry people. And virtually all estimates are that by 2050, just to meet rising food demands, we're going to end up with more cropland and more pasture land. And that's a challenge because virtually every strategy for solving climate change assumes that we quickly phase out all emissions from land use change. And most assume that we actually have net reforestation by 2050. So how do you simultaneously provide all that additional food? And if you look at some of these estimates, and some of the more transparent estimates, like this Buzzgel article, that's 1 billion hectares of land. I mean, we only have 1.5 billion hectares of cropland. And that's assuming, that was their estimate of assuming ongoing rates of intensification of yield gain. So if you project out to 2050, the present path, it seems likely that agriculture will emit something on the order of 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050. Now, how much is that? Well, to stabilize the climate at 2 degrees Celsius, virtually all estimates say we have to have total human emissions down around 21 gigatons by 2050. And what that means is that agriculture by itself would be responsible for about 70% of all allowable emissions, leaving virtually no room for anything else. If agriculture were to do its fair share of greenhouse gas mitigation, along with the rest of every other sector, in effect, our challenge is to produce 2/3 more food with 2/3 fewer emissions. So that's a gigantic challenge. In our new model, I won't bore you with this, in our new modeling studies, we have a slightly lower number. It turns out to be about 14 gigatons. But let me give you some idea of this, even though this is a very complicated chart. These are the emissions from production and land use in 2050 in a new study that we are going to have coming out. But the key thing is this assumes already massive improvement in efficiency. So in our baseline is that yield growth continues on balance, on aggregate, to be the same between 2006 and 2050 as it was between 1962 and 2006. And that output per hectare of pasture is roughly double the rate of growth that it was. And one of the challenges when you do these estimates is that if you're too pessimistic in your baseline, people think you're just kind of raising horror stories. But there's a real risk that you build into your baseline something that's a little optimistic, and then people think that you've already got there. So just to reach this situation, just to reach this challenge, we have to have this very high rate of yield gain, both in the area of crops and livestock production. And we have to do that entirely by being smarter. Yield gains from 62 to 2006 involved doubling irrigation, bringing synthetic fertilizer to most of the world, and bringing scientifically bred seeds to most of the world. Now, with some exceptions, we've pretty much done that. So everything pretty much from now on has to come from farming smarter. And sometimes this is underestimated because people assume that yield gains have exponential growth, and then if you take growth rates and you bring them out to the future, you look just great. But we now are pretty confident that yield growth is linear, which is not that complicated. You see that here for grains. And when you do that, and also when you account for the fact that we're going to have higher growth in vegetables and some other sectors, oil seeds, that's where you get your big challenge. One of the things, I'm going to keep coming back to this, is continuously underestimated is the role of pasture. So pasture is 2/3 of all agricultural land. It's probably more than half of all land use change. It produces a lot of feed. It just gets converted into food fairly inefficiently because we do it in the form of beef and mutton and milk. And people think that pasture is free because there's 1 billion, 1.5 billion hectares of pasture out of the 3 billion that were naturally grazing land. And so you just occupy those. But the other half of pasture was basically forest or pretty densely woody savanna. And we already have used all of our grazing land, our native grazing land, long ago. So new pasture for a long time has come from clearing tropical forest and woody savanna. And that releases a lot of carbon and has huge biodiversity effects. So now let's look at the role of population. And this is pretty well known among demographers. The basic story is we're going to have a little bit more than 2 billion more people by 2050. Roughly speaking, half of those 2 billion people, are going to be in Asia. And there's nothing we can do about that unless we want to go around killing children. Because this is due to the fact that fertility rates were high in Asia until fairly recently, but they've come down in Asia as in most of the world. And the reason we're going to have 1 billion more people in Asia is largely due to demographic momentum. As young people age, they have more children. There's nothing we can do about that. But in Africa, we're also going to have more than 1 billion people. And in Africa, it's the one region where fertility rates have not come way down. We still have on the order of more than 5 children per mother in Africa. And therefore, the population has already grown in the time we've been working on these reports from about 700 million to more than 900 million. We're on our way to 2.2 billion by 2050, maybe 4 billion by 2100. And so Africa is the real center because, of course, Africa is where yields have been lowest, where hunger is highest, and where you have this highest population growth. And the other factor is the dietary change, and I'll come back to this. So we know, everyone knows that a big part of the challenge is eating more milk and meat. Actually, the numbers that I gave you are not that bad on a global per capita basis. FAO's projections, which we're using, are essentially, I think it's a 23% increase in per capita, in per capita, per capita livestock consumption. That's not that much. It actually assumes that 6 billion people, all these people, in 2050 still eat on average fewer than 300 kilocalories of livestock products per day, compared to 800 to 900 in the developed world. So just to make room for a little bit more livestock consumption by that 6 billion people, we need to have hold down dietary change, or we need to hold down our milk and meat consumption in the developed world. And everything, by the way, I've said is without regard to biofuels. That assumes no increase in biofuel production. And just to give you some idea, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I work on this, so you're going to always get one slide from me on biofuels. People talk about producing 20% of world energy from bioenergy by 2050. How much of the world's plant harvest would you need to supply 20% of the world's energy in 2050? The answer is 100%. The actual physical, the maximum energy that can be released by perfect burning of all the world's harvested biomass is about just enough to make about 20% of global energy supply in 2050. All the world's crops are far, far less than that. And so if we have any significant amount of bioenergy, everything I've said about solution kind of goes out the window. Okay, so again, let's now talk about diet. What can we do on diets? So the key thing I said is that ruminant meat produces this fantastic amount of land use demand and emissions, but it actually produces a vanishingly small amount of calories. 2% of global food calories. In the US, this is a complicated slide, but here's what I want you to focus on. If the whole world, if this is what would happen if the whole world on average consumed the US diet, and all this red is ruminant meat. Half of the land use demand just comes from ruminant meat, and half of all the production emissions just come from ruminant meat, and that produces 2% of global calories. And when you actually think about the level of emissions that are implicit in devoting that much land, in other words, if you reverse and say, if we didn't devote that much land to beef, and said how much carbon could we store on that land, and then count the loss of that carbon as a cost, the typical emissions from a US diet are 15 tons of CO2 equivalent. How much of 15 tons? Our total energy emissions are only a little bit more than 15 tons. So in effect, if you count the true land use significance of an average American's diet, it causes emissions implicitly that are roughly the equivalent of total energy use in the US. So what does that mean? One of the lessons is that we have to hold down livestock production. So one of the things, on the one hand, we have to produce livestock products more efficiently, but we really have to hold down beef consumption. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the importance of improving the efficiency of that production. So this is a thought experiment in which we say, what would happen to land use and emissions in 2050 if we tried to meet these dietary demands in 2050 with today's production systems? And what you end up with is you have today's livestock production systems. Crop yields grow up, but we use today's livestock production systems. Production emissions go up from the agriculture sector to about 12 gigatons. Land use change emissions go up to about 20 gigatons. So the food sector alone would produce about 50% more emissions than are allowable from all human sources by 2050 if we want to stabilize the climate. So what that means is that improving the efficiency of livestock production, even if we hold down milk and meat consumption, is absolutely critical. So that's a challenge, right? All the economists here are saying, wait a second, if you're going to improve the efficiency of livestock production, you may make it cheaper to eat livestock products. But we want people not to eat so many livestock products. So how do you do that? Okay, here's another example, though. If we improve the efficiency, we not only have less land use, we also have a lot fewer emissions per kilogram of product. So this is a study that shows the enormous difference in emissions per kilogram of product for beef, and milk is similar between developing countries and the developed countries. And we don't have to go all the way to modern agricultural production. By the way, most of the cows are in developing countries. But we can actually do lots of things that improve the quality of feed that are consistent with what can actually be done. Improved grazing practices, improved quality of grasses and forages. And of course, Pierre Gerber does a lot of work on this, and he's done some great work showing these estimates. And now let me go back to so one thing is we have to hold down diets, and what that means, and we have to improve efficiency, and then let's deal with the population issue. So I want to come back to Africa. FAO projects very large yield gains in Africa by 2050. But given the population growth, you are still contemplating more than 100 million hectares of additional agricultural land just to provide food, even while still importing 20% of staple calories. So that does mean that it's important to try to deal with boosting yields in Africa. It means it's important to, even apart from all the other reasons, and important to deal with the fertility issues. And here is where I'm showing you again these high fertility rates. And here's, actually I think I don't have the slide. Here's the wonderful thing. Let me jump to here. Fertility rates, when I was a kid, the belief was that you had to become a middle class society for fertility rates to drop. And that turns out not to be true. Incredibly poor countries had extremely rapid drops in fertility, including Brazil when it was still very poor, Peru, Iran, all different cultures. And the things that each of those countries had above all were high secondary education rates for girls and low mortality rates for children. So this is the example of, I think, the ultimate win-win, because of course high education rates for girls and low mortality for children is good anyway. So if you ask me what is the single most important thing we can do to feed the world right now, it's probably to improve those things in Africa. And this is where you see the low fertility education rates. Okay, last couple of points. So we desperately need to increase production efficiencies. We need to hold down beef consumption. We need to deal with fertility rates. People will voluntarily lower their fertility rates when girls are educated and children stay alive. But we have this paradox. If you increase yield gains in many tropical countries, you will end up clearing more land in those tropical countries because agriculture becomes more competitive. So as when Brazil learned how to produce soybeans, it became a major world exporter and expanded its total soybean use even with yield gains. The same is true of beef. Now that probably helps to spare land deforestation elsewhere. It helps to allow land to reforest in Europe, but it's not an equal trade from an environmental perspective or a greenhouse gas perspective. Now what this suggests is there is a great global deal to be made. The global deal is everybody focuses on improving production efficiencies in developing countries, but in return, developing countries have to use that to protect their forests. Now that's an issue of governance because it's going to become more economical, right? If it's all of a sudden more economical to clear your forest, you want to put a highway through your forest. So I think one of the big opportunities and challenges for the World Bank is how does it synthesize those two? How does it put programs together that simultaneously help countries to boost yields and use that to protect forests? And it's not just because of the global benefit of protecting forests. There are studies that suggest in Africa that the rate of clearing of forest could cause a local temperature effect that is additively more harsh to agriculture than climate change itself, because forests have a local cooling effect. So it's needed even for the agriculture purpose. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and just summarize these recommendations. Some of them you've gotten already. When you think about livestock production and think about Africa for a moment, I think Africa desperately needs improved access to livestock products, but it shouldn't be beef. Anything but beef. We should be focusing on milk. We should be focusing on small livestock, and among other things, you produce a lot more food for each person anyway doing that. So there's a cultural challenge there, but a real opportunity there. And the only other couple things I want to mention that I haven't talked about here are the role. I want to talk about the role of D in R&D. So we know how to do a lot of things in general, but we don't necessarily know how to do it in specific. So we can talk about the principle that we basically need to have our agricultural expansion in places that maximize food production per ton of carbon released. But that doesn't mean we've actually mapped out where to do that in particular countries. We know that we can reduce emissions by and possibly even boost yields with proper water management and rice production. But that doesn't mean anyone's actually figured out where in your producing rice you actually know how to do that. And what was missing is I call the D in R&D. This is the kind of basic applied science that allows you to figure out exactly what to do. And so that, I think, is another role for World Bank projects. If those projects can help to develop the localized applied information, that could be enormously helpful and help guide the use of those funds. And so I'll leave you with that because I think I've said enough, and then I'm going to ask some questions of our panel. Thanks very much.